Oh, hello there. My name is Trey, and today we're going to be talking about Figma. What it is, how you can use it, why it's amazing, and why you should care. I am involved in a number of online communities for witches and wizards and occultists and magicians, and I see the subject of which illustration software should I use? Should I pay a lot of money for software that is over a decade old and adheres to an ancient paradigm and is incredibly expensive, but that a lot of people use? Or should I go with an open source thing that is obtuse and difficult to use, but is free? And I say, make neither choice. Use amazingly beautifully designed software that is essentially free for personal use, whether you are creating a Oracle deck or a tarot deck, or you are creating sigils and seals, or you're working on your own grimoire or book of shadows. Whatever the case is where you are needing to do design for something, Figma is going to be a really powerful tool for you to learn and to use. So let's dive right into it. If you go to Figma.com, so right now we are in Figma. I'm doing all of this content directly from the application so that I can demonstrate how stuff works as we go. I'm not going to spend a lot of time like going over the UI elements or whatever, but one thing I want to point out here is that this is the desktop version of Figma. So if you go to Figma.com, you can download a desktop version for most major desktop operating systems. The Mac and Windows versions are official desktop versions supported by the company that makes Figma. There is a unofficial but very well supported Linux package as well, which you can get on as a snap or as an apt. And that actually, I work within Linux daily, and Figma in Linux is the tool that I use, the desktop version of Figma. So it's really fantastic. The desktop version gives you some nice features that just using it from within a web context doesn't have. For example, being able to utilize typefaces and fonts that are installed in the operating system. But if you're on like a Chromebook, let's say, you can still use the software and get tons of mileage out of it, and it's wonderful. So it runs basically everywhere. This is a huge benefit to it. It also means that, you know, if you are somewhere else, you're at somebody else's place and you want to bring up something that you're working on, you could just pop it open in a browser on their machine, for example. And they don't ever have to have Figma installed. It's great. If you go to Figma.com, you will see a lot of marketing text, which is targeted towards UI and UX app designers and developers working within the tech industry. And this is very smart of Figma because they are very specifically targeting this group of people, which is how you make a successful product. However, at the end of the day, Figma is an incredibly powerful design tool in its own right. All of these features around creating user experience flows and prototypes and collaborating on prototypes and sharing prototypes and all of this kind of stuff, building design systems, that it's all incredible features. But at the end of the day, if you are just trying to do vector-based drawings and illustration and, you know, sort of the basic design stuff that you want to do, well, even not basic, very complicated stuff, Figma is there for you. It is going to solve all of these things for you. And we'll get into the details of this as we go. But I just wanted to point out that, you know, if you go to Figma.com, and part of the reason why I think not a lot of people outside of the tech industry know about Figma and are using Figma is because of the way that Figma is very specifically marketed to those folks. So I'm going to try to change that, at least for this community, this wonderful community that I'm a part of. Infinite drafts for free, as I said. So basically for individual usage, Figma is free. You can have any number of drafts, and when you're working on a draft document, this is a draft document. When you're working on draft documents, there's nothing that is restricted. The application works exactly the same in any context. You can even share and collaborate on things up to an extent. Now, there are some team-based features and team collaboration features and building stuff like design systems and things like that and being able to apply them across multiple different documents, which are specific to the paid version. So generally, for individual usage, Figma is free. If you are part of a team or part of a group, then the expectation is that the business will pay for it, and that's kind of their business model. You can, as an individual, pay for it as well. It's actually not that expensive. We already talked about it runs everywhere. We're going to dig into non-destructive editing. One of the reasons that I wanted to put these videos together, and I did this as a live class, and now I'm doing this as a video for the folks that were unable to make it to the class, or for anybody else who wants to check it out. I'm probably going to do this in multiple parts as well, because the class went well over an hour, which I tried to fit it within an hour. So this, for the videos, I might break it up a little bit. So this might be part one of a multi-part series, very likely. But one of the things that I really wanted to get across to folks that are interested in this is how to think like Figma thinks. Because once you start to understand the way that Figma works, and you work within that paradigm, it will hugely accelerate your ability to work within the software, and will give you it will be significantly better than what you're going to get out of a lot of other software. So one of these things is non-destructive editing, and how you sort of layer things together, and you build up kind of a delicious design layer cake. And it's amazing. It's fantastic. Let's move along. Ooh, that moved along a little bit further than I wanted to go. As I said, I'm actually doing this within Figma, so this is all of the content of the deck. I hit Shift 1 to zoom out and show everything that's on the canvas. Shift 2 is the sort of zoom into the selected thing. Before we get into actually drawing, one more topic in the context of how do you think like Figma thinks, is to understand frames and groups and layers, and what these things are, because you're going to see them referred to, like, especially if you go to the help or the documentation, which at first you're probably going to hit a few times. It's good to know what these things are and kind of how to think about them. You can think of a frame as a rectangular box in which you're going to put stuff. I'm going to draw stuff within a frame. Like, imagine it as like a literal frame on a gallery wall, and the art is going to go within this frame. So that's kind of how to think about frames. However, Figma is also not particular about, sort of saying like, well, frames can only go on the canvas. So if I zoom back out here, this gray area back here is the canvas. And then we have various frames laid out on it. Figma is very flexible. You can have frames within frames. So you can nest frames. I have an outer frame, an inner or middle frame, and then an inner frame. And each one of those frames also has a text element inside of it. So if I select this frame and I move this frame around, you can see that I'm moving the entire frame content. I'm not going to dig too much more into that, but I think it is important to talk a little bit about what groups are and what layers are in this context as well. Frames are, as I said, kind of a top level thing that you put stuff within. A group is things that are related to each other in some way, or going to be sort of part of the same, I'm going to say element in this particular case because we're getting overloaded in terms, that are related, that are all going to go together. Each group can have things that are applied to each layer of the group. And I'm going to show how this looks because it's very difficult to describe, but once you see it in action, it's really cool. But a group is just several things that are related to each other. And a layer is literally any single thing within your document. All of these things, so you can actually see that this panel on the left is called the layers panel, and it's showing each one of these frames is a layer. This text element is a layer. If we had individual vector drawings, those would be layers. An image would be a layer. So a layer is simply anything within any single thing, basically, within the document. Let's actually just dig into drawing some stuff. I put a little note to myself here about Control-Shift question mark, which brings up the quick help, which will show you the hotkeys for many of the actions within the software. If you've watched any of my other videos, you will know that I'm a big proponent of using software that's really good, like Figma, and getting very good at the hotkeys and the workflows within that software so that you become so good at it that you don't even have to think about it. There's zero resistance to going from I need to do a thing to the thing is done, or at least as little resistance as possible. At first, there will be a lot of friction because you won't know all of that stuff. But the more time you spend upfront learning those hotkeys, learning how to use the software well, learning how to think like the software thinks, will pay dividends down the road when you're using the software and you're like, oh, I've got this really great idea, or I need to, jump in on, card 34 of my Oracle deck or whatever. You'll be able to just dive right in and use the software. It'll be great. So spend that time, it pays dividends. Because we are magicians and witches and whatnot, I was trying to come up with some good examples to start with from a drawing perspective. And I'm going to draw some astrological symbols and a hexagram and a pentagram. And I picked these particular shapes because each one is going to kind of peel the layers of the onion of how you draw and create content within Figma, starting from super easy and getting more and more complex as we go. If you're used to other illustration type software, you will be familiar probably with tools that allow you to draw things like polygons or like a square or a circle. And all of this stuff is within Figma as well. So we'll start super simply by the sun glyph obviously is a ring with a dot in the middle. I'm going to hit the O key on my keyboard to select the ellipse tool. You can think of this as the O looks like a circle. So it's easy to remember. Even though it's not an E for ellipse, which sometimes gets you, it's an O for the shape. Anyway, so I'm going to click and drag on the frame that I have here. And you can see that as I'm holding down my click and the shape, I can create a shape of, I can create a circular shape or an oval or whatever. If I hold down the shift key, it will maintain the width and height proportions so that I can create a perfect circle. You can also hold down the Alt key, which will position it based on the center point that you clicked on. So one thing I could do if I'm drawing the circles, I could kind of start here in the middle, start drawing it, hold down Shift to maintain the proportions, and hold down Alt to draw from the center point. And then if I click and drag it, I can kind of center it exactly in the middle. There's these little red guide marks, which you can see. The guiding system and how layout and laying things out relative to each other works in Figma is the best in any software I've ever used. It mostly just works. You will very rarely shake your fist at it. You will shake your fist at it, but a lot less than you will with other software. So now we have this circle. It is currently filled with a color. So if I look over here on the right-hand side, this is kind of the detail panel for the layer that I have currently selected, which is this ellipse. And you can see that we have a fill and no stroke. And we actually want to swap that around. We want to have an outlined circle and we don't want to have it filled with a particular color. So you can swap the fill and the stroke by hitting Shift X. This is a very handy hotkey to remember. And then I'm going to change a couple of the attributes of the stroke here to just make it black, and I'm going to make it quite thick because we're going to want to zoom out and have the sun glyph look good, very zoomed out. Drawing things in proportion to the canvas in which you're drawing them is basic illustration stuff. That's not a Figma thing, that's just a drawing thing. So we've got this outer circle here. I'm going to grab a corner to resize it, hold down Alt and Shift, just like we did before, and I'm going to stretch it out to the full shape. Now, I want to point out a couple of things with the ellipse here. So this ellipse is a special kind of shape that has properties that are specific to the kinds of things that you might want to do with an ellipse. For example, we have a little arc tool here, and if I drag that, we will get a partial circle. And if I drag the this ratio handle out of the middle, we can carve out the section of the middle so that we get an outline. If you drag it all the way to the outside, you will get just the line shape based on the thickness of the stroke. And then you can move the sweep, this control, which is called the sweep, to make an arc. We're going to use that when we get to the Mercury symbol to create the little horns of the Mercury, as you can imagine. But for now, I just wanted to kind of point out that the ellipse drawing tool has things that are specific to an ellipse in it. And we'll show how that works in some other things as well, some other tooling. So we've got this outer circle to our sun. And now I'm going to hit O to create one more ellipse. I'm going to hold down Shift to make it perfectly circular. I'm going to hit Shift X again and change the, oh, actually, I'm going to hit Shift X yet one more time, actually, because I actually want this one to be filled. And I'm going to come up here to the width and the height, and I'm going to set the radius to 60. So there you have it. We have our sun symbol. If I zoom out here, you can see that it looks pretty good. Quite simple, quite straightforward. Let's move on to a slightly more complicated example. So for the moon, we're going to do kind of the same thing that we did just then. I'm going to draw out a circular shape here, and I'm going to kind of move it over to the left. I'm going to leave it filled, turn it black here. We're not doing a lot of stuff with color or anything like that. A little bit later on, we're going to be talking about gradients and color and all of these kinds of things. It's very, very powerful what you can do in the software, but I'm just keeping it simple for right now. I'm going to click and drag on the ellipse, which allows you to move it. But if you hold down the Alt key while you do that, you'll create a duplicate. And I'm going to just drag that out over here. And so you can see that we have these two ellipses. Now I'm going to select both ellipses, and if you're familiar with other software that supports binary operations, this is not going to be a big surprise to you. And I'm going to, in this drop down up here at the top, which allows you to do binary operations, I'm going to select the subtract selection option here. And that is going to subtract the one shape from the other, which gives us this kind of crescent moon shape. But it's a little bit too thick, and I kind of want it to come around a little bit more, you know, like how a nicely designed, you know, sort of lunar glyph. It doesn't actually look exactly like a crescent moon. It usually comes around a little bit more. So I'm not super happy with this, right? Now, if I had done this in other software, this would be done. And I would have to undo and then redo and kind of, you know, go back and forth trying to get what I want. However, going back to non-destructive editing, this shape is still composed of the individual shapes that it was made of. So you can see here that I have a little drop-down arrow, and my original ellipses are still here. So I can now edit them. This ellipse right here, which is the one that's being knocked out of the other shape, I'm going to scale it down a little bit. I'm going to hold down Alt and Shift and kind of scale it down a little bit, and then I'm going to move it in here, and I'm going to get kind of something that's about the same thickness as I had for my other lines. It's a little bit thicker, but you get the general idea. Now, if I select this top level grouping, you know, I can recenter that, and this thing in and of itself is a shape. So I can work with the shape, or I can still work with the shapes that make up that shape. So you can start to kind of see how the layers build. Now, this grouping of stuff, while it's providing this knockout, also has its own attributes. And we're going to get into why this is cool a little bit later. But you can start to kind of see how the layers build up and how non-destructive editing is amazing. So now we have our little crescent here. I'm going to zoom back out so you can see, looks pretty good. We could actually make it a little bit thicker. You know, design, it's one of those things you could fiddle with it until the cows come home. So Mercury, a little bit more complicated, but still basically everything that we've already talked about. Now, obviously we need the sort of crescent above it. I'm going to click and drag and hold Alt and get it kind of, I don't know, a little bit close here. And you can use the arrow keys on the keyboard to move things by incrementally by smaller amounts. You can hold down Shift to do it by slightly bigger amounts. If you're used to other software, this will be familiar to you. So I'm just going to kind of line that up visually how I like it. And then I'm going to grab the little arc tool like we did before, I was showing you. I'm going to drag this over, and then I'm going to drag this out to give us our little horn shape. So now I'm going to move these things up here and just kind of line this up with the edge of the screen. For drawing the little cross part at the bottom, you might be tempted when you are first using Figma to come to the little shape tool and use the line tool, which you can also easily get to with the L key, and then draw a line. A line in Figma is something that is meant to be lined up based on the edge of the line. This is really good when you want to have a line, you know, sort of trimming something, or, you know, a border between something and something else. So if I make this nice and thick here, you can see that my line actually has control handles which are on the edge of it. Let me go ahead and make this a vertical line So you can see how this will line up. If I wanted to try to line this up with the middle of my shape, you can see that it's actually pinning to the edge. And that's because that's how a line works in Figma. This is very useful in some contexts, but in this context, it's not. So we're not going to use the line tool. We're going to create our first vector image, or our first vector drawing, which we're going to do by using the pin tool, which you can get to by hitting the P character, or you can select this little fountain tip pin looking thing. I'm just going to click kind of here in the bottom somewhere. I'm going to hold down Shift to create a perfect vertical line. And then I'm going to hit Escape to end the line, and I'm going to hit Escape again to leave the vector drawing mode. Now, I'm going to get into more of the vector drawing stuff as we go, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that here, but just letting you know quickly what keys I'm hitting. And I'm going to make this the correct thickness, and you can see now that I can line it up perfectly with the center point, and it works more in the way that you would expect a line tool to work from other software. So now that we have that, I'm going to just click and drag that, hold down the Alt key. I'm going to rotate that by 90 degrees and drop that back in here, and I'm going to line that up. And as you can see, it already kind of lined up at the center. Most of the alignment tools just work the way that you want them to. It's really great. And there you have it. We have a nice little Mercury symbol. Yay! Cheers. Okay, let's move on to an equal arm cross. Drawing the cross, obviously, we're going to do it exactly like we just did for the Mercury symbol. I'm just going to draw a line here, and then I'm going to click and drag that, hold down Alt, and I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees, and I'm going to put that back over the middle point here. And so now we have this cross, and I can select both elements of the cross, which I could either do by clicking and dragging over them, or I can select them over here. And I'm going to do another binary operation. In this case, I'm going to do a union operation, which is going to combine both of these things into the same shape. Now, it still looks the same. I haven't done, it's not like the knockout like we did with the moon, right? But now these two objects are sort of part of the same union group. So now I can edit them together, and they will, for the most part, act like it's a single thing. But of course, we still have the two lines that make up the union. However, let's say that I wanted to stylize this a little bit, and I wanted to give it some rounded corners. I can change the corner radius of the, and I'm just clicking and dragging on that, which you can do for most fields in Figma to kind of slider adjust them. And I'm going to give it a little bit of a rounded corner. Now, this rounded corner is actually being applied at the union, not on the individual items themselves. And what this means is that I can still click and drag an individual item, and as you can see, the rounded corner is being applied to the union of the two, I was going to say the union of the two towers, by the two objects. This is going a little bit outside the box here, but if I select this union, the cross shape, and actually I could even just rename this. I could say cross. Now, if I click and drag this and hold down Alt, I'm going to make a duplicate of that. Now I have these two separate instances of the two separate layers, which are a grouping of two separate items each. And I'm going to select both of those, and I'm going to union them. And then I'm going to select a rounded radius for that as well, which is going to be slightly different rounded radius. Let's make it even bigger. Select one of these elements, and you can see that it is applying the rounding at the level of the joint of the two things, plus, so I think you can start to understand how these things begin to layer together. And this is a very powerful way to work. Once you get into this paradigm of non-destructive editing, it's really fantastic. So that's kind of what I wanted to show there, applying some attributes at the grouping level. Okay, let's go. I think for this video, since we're already almost a half an hour in, I think I'm going to finish off with the drawings here, and then we'll start with a deep dive on vector networks and how vector drawing really works within Figma at the start of the next video. So let's draw a hexagram. We're going to use a new tool which we haven't used yet, which is called the polygon tool. There's no hotkey for it. You don't use it so often. But I'm just going to, it defaults to a triangle here, and I'm going to drag out our triangle. And, you know, all of the basic stuff here, I'll have to go ahead and do the Shift X and make it black and make the same line thickness. Okay, so there we go. Now, a couple of controls that you have here is you have a corner radius, of course. Rounded corners is something that Figma loves, and it makes it very easy to do. But you also have a polygon count here, which gives you a number of points in your regular polygon shape. For you magicians out there, and witches and wizards, this is kind of a nice thing to know. You're probably going to use this. But anyway, so we have our nice little triangle shape here. And I'm going to just click and drag and hold down Alt to duplicate it. And I'm going to flip it horizontally. And I'm going to line these two things up to their center points and select both of them and move them into the center of the canvas here. And now that I have both of these selected, I'm just going to hit Command G to group them together. Now this is a group that has no attributes applied at the grouping level, like it's not doing any kind of like union or anything like that. I could easily switch this over. I could simply click on the union button and turn that into a union. But I don't need to do that in this particular case. I'm just going to leave it as a grouping. And then I'm going to hold down the, I'm going to click and drag on the corner, which does resize, hold down Shift, hold down Alt to resize it from the center point, and scale this out. When you resize something using the regular selection tool, which is this, it's called the Move tool, which you can get to with V, the character V on the keyboard. If you're familiar with other software, that's very commonly the hotkey for that. Now, when you resize things in Figma, you'll notice as I'm scaling down, it's not changing the line width of the lines in my vector image. And when I'm scaling up, it's not changing them as well. So relative to the overall size of the object, it's changing. However, there is a separate tool for, so this is technically resizing. There's a separate tool which is called the Scale tool, which you can get to by hitting the K key on the keyboard. And the Scale tool will try to smartly resize the attributes of the objects as you resize the element, or resize the layer. So this is nice for, like in this particular case, we want to keep our 30-point stroke width. So I'm going to click and drag this corner, I'm going to hold down Shift, I'm going to hold down Alt, and now that we're using the Scale tool, it's going to maintain that line thickness. And fill that out. Okay, let's just see what that looks like. Yeah, looks pretty good. Let's get into our one last complicated example. And this is going to be kind of a little bit of an intro to vector networks and paving the way for the next video. We're going to lay out a pentagram. And while we could potentially use the star tool here, so the star tool gives you a 5-pointed star, like right out of the gate. And so you could say like, that's great. Like, why do we need to do anything else? Well, let's go ahead and swap over given our stroke, 300, hello. You can see that this is a star, not a pentagram, right? Because we're not getting the cross lines. It's not actually drawn as a pentagram would normally be drawn. So that's not quite exactly what we're looking for. We could actually modify this to make it look correct. That is one way that you could do it. But instead, let me show you a different way that's slightly more complicated, but not super more complicated. We're going to start first by using the pen tool, and we're going to draw a line. And I'm just going to hold down Shift to create a vertical line. Doesn't really matter how big it is. You can hit Escape to close that out, Escape again to get out of the vector edit. And I'm going to make the line pretty thin. I'm going to make it a 2-point line. I'm going to click and drag it and hold down Alt, and I'm going to rotate it by 360 divided by 5. Because we have 360 degrees in our circle, and then we're going to divide that by 5 because we're going to have 5 points along that circle. And that's going to give us 72 degrees, of course, but you can see that you could do math within these fields. This is a super handy thing to be able to do, by the way. For example, now that we've got this, I'm going to click and drag and hold down Alt again to make another duplicate, and I'm going to say 72 times 2. And so on and so forth. One more time, actually 2 more times, I'm going to do this, 72 times 3. And you can see that in the 72 times 3 case, it gave us negative 144. So for our last leg here, I could just say negative 72. negative values work as well. Okay, so now we have kind of our star shape outline, which we're going to use to actually draw our pentagram in the way that you would draw it on paper, for example. But before we do that, what I want to do is I'm going to select all of these lines, and I'm going to hit Command E, which is the flatten tool. You can also right-click. All of the right-click menus work like you would expect in normal software. And you can use the flatten tool, which is going to turn all of those lines into a single vector network. We're going to talk about vector networks literally in the next slide. You can see there at the start of the next video. But for now, all you really need to know is that these are now part of the same sort of drawing. And I'm going to double click to edit this. And now because we had multiple lines and we sort of joined them all together, we have each one is kind of its own separate little thing within this vector network. And I actually, in order to delete this shape, once we get our star shape drawn, I actually want to join all of these little middle parts. And this is super easy to do by just dragging and dropping them on top of each other. And with a couple times doing that, we now have our shape. This is part of the power of vector networks, which we're going to get into, as I said, very soon. But now we have a single individual shape, which we are going to be able to easily delete, which is the whole point of doing that. I'm going to say that I'm done there. Actually, sorry, I'm going to go back into editing by double-clicking on this vector network. We're going to go into editing it. I'm going to select the pen tool, or you can hit P. And now we're going to draw our pentagram just like you normally would. I'm going to go from point to point, draw out our pentagram, which is now going to be perfectly shaped. And now we have that. I'm going to hit V to go back to our selection tool. I'm going to select this little middle node here, and I'm going to hit delete. And now we have a shape that is our perfect star shape. I'm going to make the line width what it's supposed to be. Let's go ahead and center this in the middle of the document, or sorry, in the middle of the frame. Hold down Shift and Alt, resize it up here, well, about right there. And there you have it. We have our star shape. So that gives you a little bit of a inroad into what we're going to be talking about in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope that these videos are going to be super useful for folks. Stop using crappy software. Like, no offense to some of the open source alternatives to vector drawing that are out there. It's hard. It's really, really hard. But Figma is just absolutely fantastic. It's free for individual use. Just get in there. There's tons of videos online too showing how to use the software. There's tons of documentation, everything. It's great. But I will see you in the next video, which maybe we'll just get everything done in the next video. We're going to be talking about hand drawing. We're going to be talking about gradients. We're going to be talking about the component system, which is super powerful, type, doing radial layouts, working with images, and very importantly, how you export things and all of the different formats you can export to. Maybe I'll fit all of that into the next video. So there you have it. I hope everything is fantastic wherever you are and that you're staying healthy and safe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.